Chapter 5. A Grisly Catch. The gulls were not yet awake, and the night fishermen were still out at sea. A dismal grey half-light lit the water on the horizon, but inland the shadows were deep and velvety black. All Whitby slept, and the streets were as still and silent as death. The waves fell softly against the shore, dragging the sand down as they retreated. The tide was going out, and behind Tate Hill Pier, dark and deadly rocks were beginning to emerge. Vicious boulders, they had sunk many unwary ships in their time. They were the teeth of the East Cliff, always eager to grind and splinter timbers. On the treacherously smooth, slippery shore, 3 small figures appeared. They seemed to step out of the sheer cliff face, though in the gloom it was impossible to see properly. They were 3 Alfwaders. Those families who have worked and lived in Whitby for generation after salty generation might recall the old tales of the fisherfolk, or the old whalers, as some called them. They were mysterious beings in legends told to wide-eyed children as they lingered in the tobacco smoke-filled parlours before traipsing off to bed. Creatures from half-forgotten stories, brought home by sea-weary fishermen, remembered late in the night, if at all, when the winds howl down the chimney like the wail of the Barguest and the fires burn low. Then these childhood fancies return to haunt the aged and disturb their nodding sleep. The 3 indistinct forms clambered over the boulders. Slowly and deliberately they went, pausing only to peer into the rock pools that the tide had left behind and to part the thick clumps of weed washed ashore. They were searching for something. Nelda's grandfather prodded a loose heap of shale with his staff, as he had done every morning for the past fortnight. His old bones ached, and he grumbled to himself. "Us'll niver find out now. Been too long, I says. Them's gone for good." His face was even more crinkled with age than Nelda's. Whiskers bristled over his chin, and his wiry white hair was tied back in a long hank. The ears of all male Alfwaders were large and bat-shaped. Tar's were no exception. He scratched one with his grubby fingers and stared along the shore at Nelda and Hesper. "Them won't never gi' up," he muttered with a groan. "Can I tell them nowt?" Hesper was his daughter. She was also the missing Silas's wife and Nelda's aunt. A kindly soul, everyone liked her, or was it pity they felt? She had married the leering Silas Gull against her father's wishes nigh on 200 years ago. The more he forbade the union, the more stubborn she had become, and in the end he had relented. But a foul, black-hearted fellow Silas had remained, and nothing Hesper could do would ever change that. She climbed over the rocks with her niece. A battered old oilskin hat perched comically on her head, and her light sand-coloured hair hanging down over one eye as usual. Her face had the texture of a pickled walnut, but the lines that etched themselves so deeply there were marks of sorrow and care. To the rest of the tribe she was a tragic figure, solitary and quiet, speaking to none but her family. Even she did not know if she still loved Silas. Whatever had first attracted her to him had quickly disappeared. However, Hesper's heart was kept aflame by her true passion, her unceasing search for that which could lift the curse from them forever. Nelda lifted a thick, dripping curtain of weed, and a startled crab scuttled into the nearest shade. She looked across at her aunt and shook her head. "Nothing," she sighed. Hesper hitched up the cork life belt as it slipped down over her stomach. She was always ready for emergencies. A length of rope was tucked under one arm. 2 ancient satchels were slung over each shoulder, and, threaded through the straps of these at her back, was a small fishing net attached to a long pole. She wiped her sea-green eyes and scanned the rocks and boulders. She had not had a wink of sleep all night, and a wide yawn suddenly split her face in 2. "You should not be out," Nelda told her. "You do too much." Her aunt scooped a handful of sea-water and splashed it over her forehead. "Someone must keep the vigil," she answered resignedly. "Who else would go out as I? None. There is not one in the whole tribe who will go in my stead." Nelda smiled gently. That is because they do not believe in what you seek. To them it is a fanciful tale, nothing more. The doom will never be lifted. Hester did not reply. She was accustomed to the ridicule her quest invited, and her faith was never shaken. At this moment, however, she had just noticed a tangled mess of green nylon net in the hollow between two huge boulders. Hesper climbed onto one of the smooth, wet rocks and looked down into the untidy mess. She furrowed her brows and stooped. Was it a trick of the shadows? Beyond the twisted drapes of fishing net and seaweed, she thought she saw... Hesper breathed in sharply. "Nelda!" she uttered in a fearful voice. "Fetch Tar at once!" Nelda frowned, curious to know what her aunt had discovered. She glanced back along the shore to where old Tar hobbled along, leaning on his staff, and waved for him to hurry. "What is it?" she asked her aunt, pulling herself onto the boulder. Hesper's face was pale when she turned round to her niece. "I said, go fetch him," she said quietly. "Now!" Nelda's heart fluttered, while her eyes looked past her aunt into the darkness beyond the netting. Hesper grabbed her shoulders fiercely and pushed the young Aufwader off the rock. "Don't look," she said in a voice that she was struggling to control. Frightened, Nelda stared at Hesper, then ran, weeping, to her grandfather. The net was held down by large, round weights. Hesper leaned over and with difficulty hauled some of it away. "9 times bless me!" she exclaimed, and clapped a hand over her mouth in horror. For there, revealed beneath the chaotic jungle of net and weed, was a body. Tar strode up as fast as he could. "Shut your bluthering!" he snapped at Nelda. But behind a mask of irritation, he too was afraid. What had his daughter found, he asked himself. As he drew near to where Hesper was kneeling, he could hear her cries of despair, and saw that she had removed her hat. "Stay here," he told Nelda when they reached the rock. "Thou's too young to look on what she's found." With an effort, he pulled himself up and gazed down into the hollow. "Deeps take me," he gasped. Hesper clasped his hand and squeezed it tightly. "I can't bring myself to uncover any more," she sobbed. "What if both are in there?" Tar's old face hardened, for he had seen death before. Anyway, there was not enough time to run back to the caves for the others. Already the sun was edging over the rim of the world, and the gulls were waking. "I'll see to this," he said gruffly. "Get this end down there with Nelda." His whiskered jaw was set like granite, and Hesper did not hesitate. Down the rock she slid, and held on to her niece, waiting for the worst. With his staff, Tar cleared the rest of the netting away to uncover more of the gruesome remains. Grimly he continued, though his face was awful to see. Finally, he rocked back and turned his head from the horrible sight. "There's just the one," he told the others. Both Nelda and Hesper clung to each other. Who was it? Nelda's father or Silas? Tar shook his head at them. "I canna tell. He's in a reet state." He shivered and said softly, "Head's all battered in like. His own mother'd niver'd know him." He stretched his legs over the side so that he could drop down beside the body. There was only one way of identifying such a grisly corpse, by the pattern on its jersey. For many years the jersey, or gansi, as the fisherfolk called it, was not merely an item of clothing. The arrangement of the ribs and cables upon each was like a family crest. One close look would tell him who it was. As he bent down to examine the gansi, Tar could not help seeing the terrible mess above the neck once again. "That's never the work of rocks," he told himself bitterly. "This one's been done in." Ugly images flashed into his head. There must have been a bloody fight between Silas and Nelda's father, Abe. With a trembling hand, he rolled the body over. Abe was his son. "Nah," he whispered as he inspected the complicated rows. "Them's gold stitches right enough." Here then was Silas Gull, the black sheep of the tribe, a rascal descended from rogues. There would not be many, he told himself, who would weep over his loss. Only Hesper, perhaps. Tar whistled softly to himself as the significance of his discovery sank in. So it was Silas who had been murdered, and, from the looks of things, by Nelda's father. A fierce scowl formed on Tar's face. "Tha's in deep, dark waters, eh, blood?" he murmured, "and they cannot hide forever." The heels of Miss Boston's shoes clicked over the beautifully polished wooden floor. She had brought the children to the museum and was thoroughly enjoying showing them round. Janet had always grouped museums, art galleries and exhibitions into a great big yawn-making lump. She had only agreed to come along today because she couldn't bear the tension in the house anymore, and she prepared herself for a dull, boring morning. It was with great surprise, therefore, that she discovered the Planet Park Museum to be a fascinating place, jam-packed with curios and wonders. It was like some magnificent jumble sale of the imagination. Glass cases proudly flaunted their treasures, painstaking models of ships, Victorian dolls, a small Noah's Ark with a parade of wooden animals trailing down the gangplank, intricate works in jet, old costumes, a collection of boats and bottles, and a flock of stuffed birds. Aunt Alice watched Janet's expressions with satisfaction. They lingered by the display of jet, and the girl was dazzled by the craftsmanship of the tiaras and brooches. The old lady beamed and rubbed her hands together. Soon all the unpleasantness would be forgotten. So long as she stuck to her side of the bargain, all would be well. Still, she cast a wistful eye at Ben and sighed. It was a pity the meetings of the circle had to end. "And here," she began, bubbling with joy, "is one of our most wonderful masterpieces, Dr. Merriweather's Tempest Prognosticator." With a flourish of her hands, she introduced a grand glass dome, which housed a very peculiar mechanism indeed. At the top were lots of little bells attached to long strings, which hung down into small glass jars about the base. Janet looked into the jars and grimaced. They contained revolting furry grubs. Aunt Alice saw her and laughed. "Leeches," she informed the girl. "Apparently those slimy little creatures could tell when a storm was coming and would jiggle about in their jars, causing the bells to ring. Isn't it a marvellous thing altogether?" And she clasped her hands together and heaved a great sigh. "It's disgusting," remarked Janet. "They could have cleaned the jars out." On any normal day, Ben would have been fascinated by the mouldy remains of long-dead leeches, but he merely twitched his eyebrows and waited for the tour to end. He had stared at all the exhibits without enthusiasm because his mind was crammed too full of his meeting with Nelda. For most of the previous night he had lain awake, wondering if she would come to the cliff top the next evening as arranged. He could not bear the painfully slow movements of the clock on the museum wall, and threw it a suspicious glance to see if it was working properly. They left Dr. Merriweather's brainchild and wandered round to a scale model of the Abbey. Janet looked at it and realized that something was not quite right. Of course, it showed the building at some earlier time. Miss Boston's eyes were sparkling as she explained. "This is how the Abbey looked before the great west window collapsed in 1794, and the central tower fell in 1830. "Was anyone hurt?" asked Janet. "Bless you, no," Aunt Alice explained. "Why, nobody ever went there much in those days, except artists and dogs." Janet frowned. "Dogs? Why, yes. Apparently, after the tower collapsed, they discovered the crushed body of a large dog under the rubble." "How sad, the poor thing." Some distance away, Ben licked his top lip and stared down wide-eyed. For the first time that morning, his interest was engaged. He had wandered off, leaving his sister and Aunt Alice, for something unusual had caught his eye. In a glass case, all of its own, was one of the most hideous objects he had ever seen. A severed human hand. It must have been very old, for the skin was dry and grey, but you could still see the fingernails and the wrinkles on its knuckles. A delighted shiver ran down Ben's back. He loved macabre horrors like this. Janet and Miss Boston soon joined him. The girl pulled a face, and the old lady's chins quivered as she explained what the ghastly thing was. "A hand of glory," she uttered in a thrilled whisper. "This unpleasant little item was used as a charm by witches and burglars many years ago." "What has?" asked Janet grimly. "A back scratcher?" And Alice cackled. "It was believed in those times that this charm, if used properly, could put to sleep an entire household so that a thief could ransack the place without anybody stirring." She paused and waited for encouragement to continue. There was none, so she rattled on regardless. "A true hand of glory had to be cut from a man while he was still dangling from the gallows. It then had to be pickled and dried, and the fingers set alight." And Alice stopped in mid-sentence, for Janet had balked and was looking ill. "I'm so sorry, dear," she said in alarm. "Did I go too far?" "I think I'll sit outside if you don't mind," Janet said quietly. "I need some fresh air." Miss Boston blinked and assumed her guilt-ridden face. "Oh dear," she murmured. "Tell me more about the gallows," asked Ben eagerly. The old lady coughed. "I think it's time we left too, Benjamin." For the rest of the day, Ben was restless and fidgety. He drifted about the town like a lost soul, counting the hours till it was time to meet Nelda again. The afternoon dragged on, and he was so out of sorts that he totally forgot about visiting the lifeboat museum. To celebrate their truce, Aunt Alice and Janet went into a small cafe for a cream tea. There they met another of the old lady's friends. Mr. Roper was a soft-spoken old man, smelling of brilliantine and mothballs. He pulled his chair over to the table and proceeded to tell them the morning's gossip. Janet listened to him politely, but felt sorry for the old man. He was obviously lonely and had nothing better to do than take part in the scandal-mongering of the Whitby busybodies. Among the useless tidbits he divulged was one interesting fact, however. A Mrs. Rowena Cooper had just moved into the empty house on Abbey Lane. Aunt Alice frowned at the news. Surely the house was far too damp and dilapidated to live in. She stirred her tea vigorously and pondered on the character of Mrs. Cooper, who was quickly becoming a mysterious figure. She sipped her brew in silence and stared over the rim of her cup out of the window at the passers-by, in case the focus of her thoughts was among them. At last the evening came. With his heart in his mouth, Ben ran up the 199 steps and stared about the graves. There she was, the youngest of the fisherfolk, sitting on the same tombstone and staring at the white-crested waves far below. She turned as she heard Ben running towards her, and the face he saw was marked with worry and pain. "I cannot stay," she told him at once. "I should not be here at all, but I did promise. Now I must go." "Wait a minute," gasped Ben. "What's happened?" She looked away and shrugged. "My uncle has been found," she muttered. "Oh," he said. "What does that mean? Was he hiding? Had he done something horrible to your father?" She pulled the woolen hat from her head and let the wind seize her hair. "Silas was dead when we found him," she answered simply. "It was he who had been killed." For a moment, Ben struggled to understand what she was saying, and then it dawned on him. "You mean your father did it?" Nelda squeezed her large grey eyes tight shut and spoke with anguish. "Never!" she cried. "He is kind and gentle. My father would not harm anything." Then she sobbed bitterly into her sleeve. Ben waited till the emotion subsided and produced a handkerchief from his pocket. Nelda took it and wiped her face. "Already the tribe shuns me and my grandfather. In their eyes, the blood which stains the hands of my father touches us also. I do not know what will befall us. The kin of a murderer must take some of the blame. That is the law, and how we must suffer it." "Sounds like a stupid law to me," Ben remarked. A slight smile tugged at the corners of Nelda's mouth. She liked this human child, and found his company comforting. "I think you are right," she answered, "for the old laws have never brought anything but pain. What use are they now to us, wanderers of the shore? The number of our years grows ever shorter. One day we shall leave both sea and sand forever, and none shall remember us." A gull screeched overhead, and its voice reminded Nelda that she did not have time to talk at length. "I must go now," she told Ben. "There's much to do, for we sent Silas on his way tonight. The black boat has been prepared all day for this, his final journey. I slipped away to see you, but I shall soon be missed. I am out of favour already. I do not wish for any more." She was suddenly interrupted by a shocked voice. "Nelda!" it shrieked. The Aufwader jumped off the tombstone as though stung and stared round in terror. Coming up the grassy slope was her aunt. Ben was overjoyed to see yet another of the strange creatures. This one looked quite comical, and delightedly he drank the sight in. The oilskin hat, the cork lifebelt, the satchels, the fishing net on the pole. Then he remembered Nelda's words. If any of her tribe were to discover that she was talking to a human, she would be severely punished. He held in his breath as he saw the stern expression on the newcomer's face and waited for her to clamber up. Nelda shrank back against the tomb as her aunt approached, wondering how she would react towards Ben. Hesper was waving her arms about like a demented windmill, and her wrinkled face had turned a peculiar shade of purple. "A human child with the sight!" she squealed in panic as she ran to her niece, skirting around Ben as though he were a bomb that might explode at any moment. "Nelda, I thought you were wiser than to mix with such creatures. And today, of all days—" She pulled up the lifebelt, which had fallen round her knees, and continued, "Come away this instant. The prayer is ready to be spoken." "Don't blame her," Ben piped up. "I made her talk to me." Hesper's crinkled face studied him distastefully for a moment before turning back to her niece. "Give thanks it was I who found you," she said. "Old Parry desired to come, and you know what a barbed tongue she has. Return with me now, and we shall speak of this no more." Nelda threw her arms around her aunt's neck. "You mean you won't tell? Oh, thank you." Hesper gave a little gasp as she struggled to get free. "Come away. Words must be said by all the tribe over the black boat before it burns." "Won't I see you again, then?" Ben asked miserably. Nelda shot a hasty glance at her aunt. Hesper pursed her lips and shook her head firmly. "Our worlds must not mix," she said with force. "Tragedy has ever occurred when such attempts are made." She gripped her niece's hand and squeezed it urgently. "Would you have the cursed Titan evermore about us?" she asked. "Is the doom that awaits us not enough, that you would seek more?" Nelda hung her head and prepared to say farewell to her human friend. She knew Hesper was right. It was wrong for her to hope of seeing Ben again. And yet, a strange feeling swept over her, like nothing she had ever experienced before. Her head swam, and the light of the setting sun faded to darkness. Nelda's eyes opened wide, and they were blacker than jet, black as the pathless voids into which her thoughts voyaged. Out of her body she drifted, and visions of things to come flashed past her. She saw a white, billowing shape high on the cliff top and heard the beat of pagan drums. A glowing form shimmered from the depths of the sea, and she uttered a cry of astonishment when she recognized. With a sickening lurch, the scene was snatched away, and her blood turned to ice. A huge, gaping maw rushed towards her. She heard the vicious hatred in its voice as a nightmarish growl issued from its scarlet throat. Nelda screamed and tumbled backwards, waving her arms before her face to fend off the evil which attacked her. Hesper and Ben knelt down by the Aufwader's side. Hesper rummaged quickly in one of her satchels and produced a leather flask. "A little liquor distilled from limpets," she explained to Ben as she poured it into her niece's mouth. In her concern, all suspicions about the boy were forgotten. "What happened?" asked Ben fearfully. "Will she be all right?" Even as he spoke, Nelda's eyes flicked open. Hesper examined them. They were soft and grey once more. "All will be well," she said, nodding with satisfaction. "It's the strain taking its toll, nothing more." Nelda choked back a cry, and she clutched her aunt's arm. "I have seen," she exclaimed frenziedly. "I saw it, Hesper, out under the waves. The time is near, and you were right all along." Hesper caught her breath and leaned back. "What did you see?" she asked in a trembling voice, not daring to hope. Nelda took hold of her shoulders and shook her joyfully. "That which you have sought so long, the moon kelp." Hesper gawped at her in disbelief for a second, then let loose a terrific squeal of glee. Ben covered his ears and wondered why they were so excited. Finally, Nelda remembered him and hurriedly told her aunt. "I do not know how this vision came to be, but I am sure this human child is caught up in our plight. Hesper, do you not see? It's written for him to play a part in this. Do not ask me how, but my heart knows his life is entwined with that of the tribe. Spurn him now, and the curse will engulf us all." Her voice and her words were powerful, and Hesper did not doubt that Nelda had been shown a glimpse of the future. The wisdom of the cold deeps had touched her for a moment. "Then we must tell the child of our woe," she said simply. Hesper struggled to her feet and looked at Ben. "Listen to me, unhappy man-pup," she told him soberly. "All that you hear from this moment on must not cross your lips to another's hearing. You understand?" Ben mumbled that he did, not sure if he was prepared for what she was about to tell him. Hesper pulled the oilskin hat further over her eyes so that they were lost in its shadow. She gazed into the distance and began. "The land has changed since our remote grandsires first harvested the waters here and wandered by the shore. It was wild hereabouts. The rocks were sharper, and the cliffs reached further into the clean sea. Your kind was scarce then, I believe, but there were many tribes of our folk." She faltered, regretting that she had not been born in such a time. "But all things must change," she continued. "The stones of your dwellings were laid here, and more of your folk made their way over the moor and over the water to settle at the river mouth. It is said that when they first came, our tribes welcomed them, but the two races were never at ease with each other. There were quarrels and fights. Never was there a more frightened creature than man. Like a rabbit he is, afraid of anything which walks under the moon." At this point, Nelda interrupted. "It was decided that we should withdraw from your world, Ben," she said. "The tribe elders asked the advice of the lords of the deep, and so the prime laws were made." A frown crossed her face as she wondered how much he needed to know. "If he is to aid us, the child must be told all," Hesper muttered gravely. Nelda swallowed and resumed the tale. "For many years, my people obeyed the strict rules of the elders, and man forgot us, or we were consigned to stories for the amusement of children. All was well, and we prospered, but not as quickly as you. How crowded became the harbour, and how tall became your ships. Yet you knew nothing of the sea. Though you girdled the world, you still learnt naught. You were ignorant of the mysteries which lie in the deeps, of the lords who could end everything if they so wished. Yes, your kind grew strong, but your might was used for bloodshed and conquest, as you slaughtered all who dared oppose you. Our forefathers were glad indeed that they had retreated from your race." "Until that fateful day," Hesper broke in, "that day which all rue now." "What happened?" asked Ben, overawed. "The two races mingled," Nelda answered darkly. "A fisherman with the same sight you possess took to wife one of our kind, and a child was born. A creature that did not belong in either world," said Hesper sadly. "The moment it breathed its first breath, the lords of the deep were aware of it, and knew the laws which they had made had been broken. When the fisherman next set sail to cast his nets, they rose against him and dragged his boat under the waves. On hearing this, the child's mother went mad with grief. She threw herself off this very cliff and was dashed to pieces on the rocks below." "There is more," said Nelda. "Cheated of their revenge, the lords vented their wrath on all women of our race. We were cursed, and the fate of our kind was sealed." "What did they do?" ventured Ben. "Our doom is a grim one," said Hesper tearfully. "Nelda's mother was one of many who have fallen victim to it." Ben did not like to ask any more questions, but it was Nelda herself who explained. "The curse of the deep ones is thus, Ben. They condemned every female of our kind to die in childbirth. A bitter vengeance it is that destroys love." Hesper laid her hand gently on Nelda's arm. "Now you see why we are doomed, for we cannot prosper, and our future is bleak. Our tribes dwindled in number, and now only one remains. A time will come when the last black boat blazes over the sea, but who will make it and oversee its departure, I wonder?" Ben stared miserably at the ground. It was a horrible story, and one he wished he had not heard. "Do not grieve yet," Nelda cried, "for there is hope, although before this night I had not believed in it myself. Only my aunt had faith, and so it is right that she should tell you of it." A dreamy look stole over Hesper's face. "The moon kelp," she murmured longingly, "that which haunts my waking hours and invades my sleep. The moon kelp. For most of my life I have suffered ridicule because of my faith in it. It appears in one of our many legends, the saga of Earl in the Darkness. I heard the story by the fireside when I was younger than Nelda. Una was a great teller of tales. Very wise she was, in many ways, save the one. All my weed and shell lore I learned under her guidance. She, too, believed in the moon kelp, the treasure of the deep ones that was stolen by Earl from the dark, cold realm. Only once in 900 years does it bloom, and then for one night only, when the moon is brightest in the sky. It was Una's favorite tale, and mine also." "But how does that help?" asked Ben, shaking his head in confusion. "Because whoever finds the lost treasure of the Lords of the Deep may ask them anything that is in their power to give," blurted out Nelda. "Do you not see? If we can discover it, we could ask them to lift the curse." "I see," Ben whistled. "But how can I help?" "Just how you are involved, I am not certain," Nelda told him excitedly. "But for an instant back then, I saw the moon kelp, and you were holding it, human child.